first of all, happy Pride Month, everyone. So good to be here at Alphabet in June. Um, and this is gonna be really counterintuitive, but my topic tonight is actually on shame. Um, so just yeah. Bear with me. I'm gonna make this all make sense. Gay shame, yes. Queer shame. Um, So part of why I'm prompted to bring this topic in is just because it's been up for me, and I feel like with many friends, folks where we have deep enough relationship to talk about something like shame, I hear it really being up for other folks. We could get into a whole analysis of the astrology and why that's happening, but that'll be a different talk. Um, but I do want to dive into this, explore it a little bit. And yeah, just acknowledging who shame is like one of those feelings I feel like I spent most of my life avoiding feeling. And so why bring in this inquiry or talk about this in the context of our practice um, in queer community, in this community Sangha, community of practice. For me, I feel like as a free queer person, um, really meeting my experience of shame and investigating where it comes from is something that I need to do on my own path of liberation. Um, So I'll say more about why as we go, but I want to start out and just ground in what did the Buddha say about shame. And interestingly, he did actually have some things to say about that. So there were a couple of concepts that show up in the teachings of the Buddha, and he talked about two different kinds of like shame or things related to shame, and one is something that he called moral shame. And the Pali word is hiri, which is Hiri. And this is a sort of a sense of our own ethics, our own integrity, like finding our moral compass or our intuitive understanding of what's right and what's wrong. And like concepts of right and wrong, of course, are so culturally constructed that I hesitate to even use those words. But what the Buddha is pointing to is that there may be something in ourselves where we, you know, look at our actions and be like, oh, did this feel like this was in integrity for me? Is this in alignment with my values? That would be another way that I would say it. And that's a healthy kind of, if we want to call it shame, it's like a useful feeling to like respond to our actions, those that were out of alignment perhaps with our values, and feel some regret about that. And then he also talked about a kind of a related concept. The Pali word is otapa. O, actually, I'm not quite sure how it's spelled. I think it's Otappa. And he called this moral fear, or it sort of translates as moral fear. And it's like the fear of doing something that may be out of alignment with our values. So, kind of thoughtfulness, scrupulousness, caring for others, caring about their concerns. So the Buddha offered these two concepts that actually are they're sort of related to shame, but they're in some ways like pretty um, healthy, like pieces of how we find ourselves in alignment, our behaviors in alignment with what we care about, with our ethics, are we really living up to our values? I think those are the kinds of things that he's pointing to. So then how does that relate in the world that we're in now? And there's just so many ways that shame is kind of mobilized in the world that we live in for um, in some ways to control us. We have this incredible legacy from the Catholic Church of using shame as a way to um, like control who we're supposed to be, how we're supposed to be in the world. And I would argue also that colonialism has very much, has taken certainly religious ideas are a big part of colonialism, but that it had its own agenda in sort of creating shame in different kinds of people, also for reasons of control. So, as queer people, we have really been um, loaded up with a lot of shame in our culture for various different reasons. Some of them, like because of these religious concepts, in some cases, because there's ways that queer people have been a threat to like again to colonialism. So it's just interesting to see as we're like in a moment right now where we're seeing kind of um, new strategies in this kind of shame war on queer and trans people, seeing this like legislation that's happening that's making illegal gender affirming care in states like Texas, other laws in other places that are really trying to make it into law some of these like religious ideas or these ideas of control about what kind of bodies we're allowed to have, what kind of sex we're allowed to have, who we can love, how we show up in the world. I saw a really interesting story in the paper in the New York Times over the last couple of weeks, and it was this very deep investigation that the New York Times did into um, the relationship between France and Haiti. And they brought forward this story that I hadn't heard before about how after the Haitian Revolution, in 1803, Haiti won their won freedom from France, from the colonial power that had brought enslaved people, brought them to Haiti, um, colonized that land. The um, folks of African descent and I think possibly indigenous people as well had risen up and had thrown off the French and declared independence. And then the part of the story that I hadn't heard before was that France had come back some 25 years later and said, either we're going to go to war with you or you have to pay us the value of the land, your land, and the value of the people who had been formerly enslaved. And because it was like such, it was with the threat of force, the Haitian government agreed to do that and over many, 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 many years paid this money to France and to many banks through terrible loans and only finished paying that money off in 1950. So it's just a really intense story about just how colonialism works. And I think I was really struck with is that like we have this idea of France as representing, liberty is like this, you know, what's the words like liberté, fraternité, equalité, like um, about freedom, love, and equality. And then, like, there's maybe a perception in the world of Haiti as being this place that can't govern itself, that's always in a mess, that's always like falling apart. And, and I just thought, oh, this is this really interesting place where actually the shame truly belongs to the French, but it's been put on Haiti in this like kind of in this way that sometimes can happen in a personal way, like in a family where an abusive, parent might put their shame onto a child. We actually see this playing out between nations, the French putting their shame onto this country that has had to pay such a high price for their freedom. So I just thought, oh, this is like a really interesting story about shame. And it really made me think about the ways that our shame gets constructed at so many different levels. Like I often think about, oh, how did my shame get constructed within my own family, for instance? And that's very real too. And I can see the ways through my, you know, my parents' homophobia and transphobia, through simple neglect, that I got a very powerful dose of shame. And things like the homophobia and transphobia, those were their shame that they were putting onto me as a little kid, that was just you know, like not even a formed human being yet, but I was already being saddled up with my mother's homophobia and transphobia because of how I dressed and how I acted and what kind of toys I played with and that kind of thing. So it's just interesting to see like this happens on so many different levels. There's that level of, there's just the level of ourselves. There's the level of like our intimate relationships in our family. And we can kind of like almost have these concentric circles of like the self, our relationships, our families, kind of community and culture going outwards. There might be like society or big institutions, governments, and then even to a bigger scale of like a global scale. So we have everything from like this global scale of shame being mobilized for colonialism in the story between France and Haiti, and all the way to like, um, my mother being uncomfortable because I only wore boys' clothes, and finding subtle ways to bring an experience of shame to me through, being less comfortable with physical contact and that kind of thing. Very subtle, but it gets across. The shame really comes through. And then it happens at all these other levels. So just and this model of these kind of nested spheres of how we get sort of shaped through trauma, through shame, come from a couple of different sources. One of them is from a book called The Politics of Trauma by Stacey Haynes. Another version of the same model comes from another book called Polysecure by Jessica Fern, but they're basically the same model. So I've found it in a few different places. And it's just been so helpful to me to think about, all of these different levels that we're impacted by. And I think when I think about shame, one of the things I notice is that so often what comes up inside of me as shame is actually something that's come to me from someplace else. And I think this is particularly true for us as queer and trans folks, that we're just on the receiving end. And it's also very true for us as people of color. We're on the receiving end of so many subtle experiences of shame that can get internalized inside of us. And and I think, there's another kind of level of complexity of like looking at some of the issues of racism and colonialism in our world, also for white folks. And I mean, I think also for me as someone who has European ancestors, I also, it can be a shame that shows up on that side of like, my ancestors have had such an impact in, I think like my Spanish ancestors in Puerto Rico. It was an incredibly brutal colonial um, uh, genocide there as well. So it's just so complex, so many layers of shame. And that's one where it's like, where there is there like, a healthy shame of seeing like, I really need to understand the ways that my ancestors did not live my values, and what can I do to make right relationships now in the present. That's like a healthy piece of it, but then there can also be a piece of it um, that is keeping us from being what we could be. And the just to notice the quality that shame has of isolating us. That when we're in a moment of shame, there can be a withdrawal, like, oh, I don't want anyone to see me in this. That's part of like the flavor of shame, is wanting to pull away, withdraw, not be seen. I think a friend who I facilitate with once like shared this analogy that was really helpful for me, of just thinking of a kid on a playground who falls down, and in that moment of like embarrassment and maybe ouch of just falling, while they were playing, they might just pop up and look around and look like, is someone, is there someone here who can take care of me? Is there someone here just to give me a hug? Or is there someone who's going to laugh at me? So there's this moment in like, even in that experience of like, oh, I really need connection, and I'm also afraid that I'll be, ostracized, made fun of, whatever. There's just like so much wrapped up in that one moment of um, like impact and embarrassment. And so I was just thinking about how actually we need the connection in that moment, that impulse to be like, oh, somebody come pick me up and give me a hug, that's like what we need in that moment. And there's also that impulse to draw away, to pretend it didn't happen, to hide. So just like noticing that that goes in both directions in that one moment of embarrassment. One of the other things that I have noticed as I've been just exploring this question for myself, how does shame show up for me? How is it that I respond in those moments? Um, One thing that I've noticed, and this is like particularly for me a pattern in like intimate relationships, I'll notice um, that there's a way when shame comes up, and it gets sort of pushed down so quickly by my own impulse to try and fix whatever it is that I think is wrong with me. So like as I came out of like family experience of neglect and my kind of like the subtle shame of um, some of the rejection that I experienced because of my gender expression as a little kid. Um, like there's a deep belief that's in there that there's something wrong with me, that there's just something inherently wrong. And that's like almost a pre-verbal belief, and it's so easy to fall into that and then to find things to attach to it. It's like first there's the belief there's something wrong with me, and then I'll figure out what it is in this particular situation that's wrong that I need to fix. And the like fixing comes and almost makes the shame not possible to see. So, like, just an example of this that's been a pattern for me is like when I'm in a new relationship, I'm someone who has a really hard time sleeping with a partner. And like, it's just a thing, and I know many other people share this of just it's hard to settle, hard to sleep. Um, and it's like, oh, especially if it's someone new, I've really caught some feels, like I really want to be able to show up in that way, and I can't do it. Like, and I'll pretend I slept even though I didn't sleep, and then pretty soon it's like, oh, I'm trying to make this new relationship work, but I'm really underslept. I'm not my best self, um, and it's like just a recipe for disaster. And sometimes I'm in a relationship and I'm like great at doing the boundaries because I'm not feeling as invested or whatever that is. So sometimes I also do great with it, but with being like, nope, no sleepovers. Um, but it's just like a place where I have a lot of shame. Like I really think I should be this person who can sleep with a partner. And so I'm trying to fix myself, trying to find all these ways to make it work. And it's not working. And I'm like stressed and overwhelmed. And often, like, just that little simple thing can be something that makes a relationship not work. And, um, and even though I know intellectually there's nothing wrong with me, there's just a lot of shame about it. And seeing that that shame moving into the fixing, trying to make something work that doesn't work for me, because I'm trying to do something for this person, actually ends up being something that really hurts the relationship because I'm not really holding my own boundaries. I'm not really showing up with my real capacity. So it's just like a real interesting way to see, like, oh my gosh, this is like a real, like, it happens so fast, it's so hard to feel it, and the shame that's there is actually, just ending up with a result that's completely the opposite of how I want to show up. um, so yeah, so again, it's like everything from these kind of interpersonal places that shame shows up all the way to um, kind of a collective experience of the ways that um, that shame, transphobia, or homophobia are mobilized at these political levels to try and create a collective shame that controls people and keeps people from being in their power. And so I'm trying in this to kind of like bridge across both because I think that they're both really important. And I was just listening to a podcast from someone named Daria Garina, and they have a kind of a course called accountability mapping that I really recommend, and I'll put their link in the chat. But I was listening to a podcast with them. It was an interview with them from the Emergent Strategy podcast, and there was some really good stuff on shame. I'm just going to read this quote from Daria. I just put their website in the chat. So, Daria says, when people who have power over us guilt or shame us, or create the conditions where guilt or shame thrive, our bodies often become smaller or withdraw. They want to hide or not be seen to protect ourselves. And I'm realizing in my own life what is not possible to do from that shape that shame produces is to be in our power to speak your truth because the shame being put on you is not yours. And the power to stand in your actions and say, yes, I did that, and to know how I want to be, and I'm sorry. So Daria's saying, like, it's both this power to stand up and take action on our behalf, and also the power to stand up and be accountable when we haven't been in alignment with our values. Both of those actions are deeply powerful. But when we are shamed or guilted, it is an attempt to take our power away from us. So I think it's like that sort of a piece that bridges both this, like, the micro and the macro. This happens in our interpersonal relationships sometimes. It happens at the macro level, at the political level as well. So it's just really interesting to know that though the shame is so hard to be with, so hard to tolerate, if we can show up for it and start to unpack it, start to ask those questions like, oh, is this mine? Is this like the piece the Buddha talks about of like the hiri and ottappa? Like, is this helping me steer towards my moral compass, steer toward to be in alignment with my values? Or actually is this shame that does not belong to me, that has been inherited, that has been received from me, came from my parents to me, came to them from their parents. Maybe this has gone back generations. Um, or is this actually like shame that's about controlling me, about keeping me from being my full self, keeping me like I truly believe as queer, trans folks, as people of color, when we show up in our full potential and our full joy, that so many systems will crumble. That is so much power, the power that we have in our queer and trans experience. So just noticing, like, oh, is this mine? Is this not mine? And of course, that insight doesn't make it go away. But it can be part of an inquiry to start to like look at it and, start to ask, like, who benefits from my shame? And what might be possible if I were not operating from this shame? And Daria in this podcast also brings in this image of shame as just a little boat, like a person in a little boat in a vast ocean of shame. And that's like the quality of shame, that we're so alone. There's no one else in the boat with us. And so can we, like, by noticing the shame and bringing our attention to it, can we start to see, one, that we're not alone? Like in my example of not being able to sleep with a new partner, many people have this experience. Like, I'm so not alone in it, but I can still feel really alone in it. And also at the political level, there are so many of us, queer and trans folks, and even though, like, laws and lawmakers are being mobilized to keep us in our box, we have so much power together. So, like, can we just invite someone, even just invite one person into that boat with us? So I've been practicing with something that I call the shame report with just a few very trusted friends. I'll like send a Marco Polo or some little message and say, here's today's shame report. Here's what I'm noticing I felt ashamed about today. And just like to even just tell one person is like so deflates the that experience of shame. So yeah, how can we bring our noticing, our practice into this piece of, it's not like we can just get rid of the shame, but that we're working to find ways to not be alone in it, to organize around the ways that we can be controlled through shame, and when appropriate, also being accountable for the things that we really have done that are not how we want to be living our values. So really, in this time that we're in, even as things feel like they're getting worse in some ways, I think there's also an opening to be dismantling these systems of oppression that sometimes are powered by shame. And so, like, doing the work of dismantling them on the inside, as well as dismantling them externally at the level, at the societal level, as well as at the community level. So that is my invitation to engage with shame as a way to dismantle systems of oppression inside and outside of us. But for me, the path of doing that is turning towards my own experience of shame and suffering and building my tolerance to be with it. So that was really bringing in the practice at the beginning of friendliness towards ourselves and compassion for our suffering. For me, that's a big piece of just building my capacity to be with the shame when it does arise, so that I can be engaging with it and bringing in the things that really help, like connection with another, thinking of other people who are suffering the same as me, rather than like getting caught in it and just going to trying to fix something about myself, which doesn't do anything about the shame. So back into our bodies. It's taking a moment to reconnect with our own sensations and just recognizing the goodness and the merit that is generated by our coming together in community and really practicing with each other, sharing our experience, and offering all of this goodness to all who need it right now, including ourselves, and sending out our wishes that all beings everywhere be safe and protected, that they be well as much as is possible, that they find some happiness, some comfort, joy, wishing that all beings be cared for, that they find peace and ease, and that all beings everywhere be well. Thank you all so much for showing up and for listening and engaging with our queer shame topic. We appreciate you all.